Commander Vex Prime's 4 eyes twitched in what could only be described as profound irritation. Standing in the pristine white corridor of the Galactic Defense Academy, he watched the latest batch of cadets shuffle nervously before the most terrifying creature in known space. The Korthak War-Beast, officially designated Scout 7 but unofficially known as the Nose of Doom, stood nearly 3 meters tall on its hind legs. Its metallic blue fur rippled with barely contained energy, and its 6 nostrils flared as it processed scents that would tell it everything about these younglings. "Attention, cadets!" Vex Prime's voice crackled through his translator. "Today marks your first encounter with a Korthak War-Beast. These creatures possess olfactory capabilities that can detect fear, aggression, deception, and, most importantly, leadership potential. The beast will evaluate each of you. Do not move. Do not speak. And for the love of the 7 suns, do not faint." The line of cadets stood at rigid attention. There was Jorik, a towering Zentarian whose rock-like skin was already showing stress fractures. Next to him, Pip squeaked softly, her luminescent tentacles dimming with anxiety. The Vorthan twins, Click and Clock, clicked their mandibles nervously in perfect synchronization. And at the far end of the line, looking remarkably relaxed for someone about to be sniffed by a living weapon, stood Marcus Kane, the human. Vex Prime had read Kane's file 3 times, hoping each reading would make more sense than the last. Born on Terra, a death world that somehow produced the most adaptable species in the galaxy. Previous military experience, classified. Psychological evaluation, demonstrates concerning levels of optimism and humor in life-threatening situations. Physical assessment, average by human standards, which translates to borderline supernatural by galactic norms. Scout 7 began its inspection. The beast moved with fluid grace that seemed impossible for something weighing half a ton. Its first target was Jorik, the Zentarian. The massive creature lowered its head, 6 nostrils working overtime. Jorik's stone-like exterior remained steady, but small pebbles began falling from his shoulders. Scout 7 spent exactly 12 seconds analyzing him, then moved on with what appeared to be mild approval. Fear present, but controlled. The beast's handler, Sergeant Thrax, translated. Adequate warrior material. Next came Pip. The small aquatic being's bioluminescent patterns shifted to pale yellow as Scout 7's enormous head descended toward her. The beast's sniffing was gentler this time, almost delicate. After 10 seconds, it made a soft, rumbling sound. High intelligence, strategic thinking, natural support role, Thrax interpreted. Excellent officer material. The pattern continued down the line. Each cadet received their evaluation. Adequate, promising, suitable, or in one unfortunate case, please reconsider civilian career options. The Korthak War-Beast had never been wrong. Not once in its 15-year service record. Then Scout 7 reached Marcus Kane. The human stood exactly as he had for the past 20 minutes, hands clasped behind his back, face displaying what Vex Prime had learned was called a slight grin. As Scout 7 approached, Kane did something that made every alien in the room freeze in horror. He winked at the beast. Scout 7 paused mid-step. All 6 nostrils flared simultaneously, creating a sound like a steam engine, having an existential crisis. The beast's head tilted, its intelligent amber eyes studying the human with what could only be described as confusion. Then it began to sniff, and sniff, and sniff some more. 30 seconds passed. Then, a minute. The beast circled Kane once, then twice, its massive form moving in a tight spiral around the stationary human. Kane, for his part, remained perfectly still, though his grin widened slightly with each pass. "What's it doing?" whispered Pip, her tentacles now flickering between purple and green. "I've never seen anything like this," muttered Sergeant Thrax, his own scaled hide shifting to an alarmed orange. Scout 7 has never spent more than 15 seconds on any evaluation. 2 minutes became 3. The beast was now practically vibrating with confusion, its powerful nose working overtime to decode whatever bizarre cocktail of sense was emanating from the human. Other Academy staff had begun to gather, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle. "Perhaps there's a malfunction?" suggested Dr. Yilnek, the Academy's chief xenobiologist. Her crystalline features sparkled with scientific curiosity. "The human physiology might be confusing its sensors." Vex Prime's tail lashed behind him. "Korthaks don't malfunction, Doctor. If Scout 7 is confused, there's a reason for it." 4 minutes. The beast suddenly stopped circling and sat down directly in front of Marcus Kane. Not the casual sitting of a domesticated creature, but the formal, attentive posture of a soldier reporting to a superior officer. Its massive head tilted up to look Kane in the eye, and then it did something that made every witness question their understanding of reality. Scout 7 whimpered, not a sound of fear or submission, but the complex vocalization that Korthak researchers had identified as the species' way of saying, "I don't understand, but I respect your authority." It was the sound a pack member made when acknowledging an alpha whose dominance transcended normal pack hierarchies. The silence in the corridor was so complete that the gentle hum of the station's life support systems sounded like a roaring waterfall. Kane, apparently oblivious to the cosmic significance of what had just occurred, reached out and gently scratched behind one of Scout 7's ears. "Good boy," he said softly. The beast's tail, a muscular appendage tipped with retractable claws that could punch through starship hulls, began to wag. "By the void," whispered Commander Vex Prime, his voice barely audible through his translator. "What exactly are you, human Kane?" Marcus looked up, his expression perfectly innocent. "Just a guy who likes dogs, sir." "Big dogs, apparently." Sergeant Thrax approached cautiously, his equipment still registering readings that made no sense. Scout 7 has never exhibited this behavior, ever. The closest comparison in our database is the reaction of a juvenile recognizing a pack leader of impossible seniority. Impossible seniority? Kane raised an eyebrow. That sounds dramatic. You don't understand, Thrax continued, his voice gaining urgency. Korthak's social structure is absolute. They recognize dominance through scent markers that indicate age, combat experience, successful hunts, territory defended, pack members protected. The more impressive the history, the stronger the scent signature. Kane nodded politely. Makes sense. Dogs back home work similarly, just less sophisticated. Human Kane, Doctor. Yilnek interjected, her scientific instruments now fully deployed and scanning both the human and the beast. What Sergeant Thrax is trying to explain is that, according to Scout 7's behavior, you possess a scent signature that indicates leadership over a pack numbering in the millions, personal combat experience spanning decades, and territorial dominance over multiple worlds. Marcus blinked. Well, that's oddly specific. It's impossible. Vex Prime's composure finally cracked. You're 23 years old according to your file. You've never served in any military engagement? The largest group you've ever led was a research team of 12 scientists. The human's grin transformed into something that made several nearby cadets take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't threatening, exactly, but it carried the weight of knowledge that the speaker had no intention of sharing. Commander, with all due respect, my file contains exactly the information I want it to contain. Scout 7, still sitting at attention, made another soft whimpering sound. This time, according to Thrax's increasingly frantic translations, it roughly meant, please tell me what to do. Pack Alpha, who transcends understanding. Kane looked down at the massive creature and spoke in a tone that somehow managed to be both gentle and commanding. Scout 7, isn't it? I need you to evaluate these cadets properly. Can you do that for me? The beast's response was immediate and enthusiastic. It bounded to its feet, tail wagging with enough force to dent the nearby wall, and began moving down the line of cadets again. This time, however, its evaluations were different, more thorough, more nuanced. Where before it had simply categorized each cadet, now it seemed to be assessing their potential for growth, their hidden strengths, their capacity for learning. Fascinating, Dr. Yilnek muttered, her instruments recording everything. It's as if the beast is now evaluating them not just as they are, but as they could become under proper guidance. When Scout 7 finished its second round of evaluations, it returned to Marcus and sat down again, looking up expectantly. "Good work," Kane said, scratching the beast's ear again. "You can go back to Sergeant Thrax now." The creature hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Kane's side. Finally, with what could only be described as a resigned sigh, it padded back to its handler, though its eyes never left the human. Commander Vex Prime stared at the scene before him, his 4 eyes blinking in a pattern that indicated deep thought mixed with growing alarm. "Human Kane, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. What are you?" Marcus considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Commander, that's a complicated question. But I suppose the simplest answer is that I'm exactly what humanity sent to your academy. The question you should be asking is why they sent me. And why did they send you?" The human smile returned, but this time it carried an edge that made even Scout 7 prick up its ears. "Because, Commander Vex Prime, your galaxy has been asking the wrong questions about humans. You've been so focused on our physical capabilities, our adaptability, our tendency to turn every situation into what you call organized chaos, that you've missed the most important thing about us. Which is? We're not just good at surviving impossible situations, sir. We're good at making other people survive them too. And when you're facing the kind of threats that require a Galactic Defense Academy to train the next generation of protectors," Kane paused, looking at each of the cadets in turn. "Well, you want someone who knows how to build a pack." Scout 7 made a sound that Thrax translated as agreement with Pack Alpha's wisdom. "Furthermore," Kane continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "my species has been dealing with pack dynamics for a very long time. We understand leadership structures, loyalty hierarchies, the delicate balance between strength and compassion that makes a group function. We've had to, because on Terra, the alternative was extinction." Dr. Yilnek's instruments were now registering readings that defied explanation. "Commander, I'm detecting biochemical markers in Human Kane's scent signature that shouldn't exist in a being of his apparent age and experience. Such as stress hormones indicating survival of multiple life-threatening situations, pheromones associated with successful protection of group members under extreme duress, chemical signatures that typically only develop after decades of command responsibility." She paused, checking her readings again. "And something else. Something I don't have a reference for in any database." Kane's expression grew thoughtful. "Doctor, what you're detecting is probably the reason Scout 7 reacted the way I did. You see, humans don't just carry our own experiences in our scent signatures. We carry the echoes of our entire species' survival story." "Impossible," Vex Prime muttered. "Is it, though?" Kane gestured to Scout 7, who was still watching him with obvious reverence. "Commander, every human carries the genetic memory of surviving ice ages, plague outbreaks, natural disasters, wars that spanned continents, and challenges that would have wiped out most species. We carry the accumulated survival wisdom of thousands of generations who faced the impossible and found a way through." He looked at the assembled cadets again. "But more than that, we carry the memory of doing it together. Every major challenge humanity has faced, we've overcome by building stronger communities, better support networks, more effective teams. When Scout 7 sniffs me, it doesn't just smell Marcus Kane, recent Academy enrollee. It smells the heir to 10,000 years of pack-building expertise." The corridor fell silent, except for the soft whirring of Dr. Yilnek's instruments. Finally, Cadet Jorik, the massive Zentarian, spoke up. "So you're saying that every human is like this?" Kane's grin returned full force. "Oh no, Jorik. I'm actually fairly average by human standards. We just tend to downplay our qualifications when we're trying to make friends." Commander Vex Prime felt what his species experienced as the equivalent of a migraine coming on. "Human Kane, are you telling me that Terra sent one of their average representatives to our academy?" "Well, sir, they did want someone who could relate to the other cadets. Someone who wouldn't intimidate the instructors too much." Scout 7 made a sound that roughly translated to Pack Alpha displays appropriate humility, while being terrifyingly competent. "Right," Vex Prime said weakly. "Of course they did." As the group began to disperse, Dr. Yilnek approached Kane with her scanning equipment still active. "Human Kane, would you be willing to participate in some additional testing? Your biochemical profile is unprecedented, and the scientific implications—" "Sure, Doc," Kane interrupted cheerfully. "But fair warning, the results are probably going to raise more questions than they answer." "How do you know that?" Kane's expression turned mysterious. "Because, Dr. Yilnek, you're about to discover that everything your databases tell you about human limitations is more like guidelines." Scout 7, who had been listening to this exchange from across the corridor, made a final sound before being led away by Sergeant Thrax. According to the translation equipment, it roughly meant, "Pack Alpha is understating things again." Typical. As the massive beast disappeared around the corner, Commander Vex Prime found himself staring at Marcus Kane with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. The human had just upended 15 years of established beast behavior protocol with nothing more than a gentle scratch behind the ears. And if Kane's casual remarks were any indication, this was just the beginning. "Human Kane," Vex Prime called out as the cadets began moving toward their next training session. "Yes, sir? Try not to break anything else on your first day." Kane's laugh echoed down the corridor. "No promises, Commander, but I'll do my best to keep the property damage to a minimum." As Vex Prime watched the human walk away, chatting easily with his fellow cadets, while Scout 7's scent still lingered in the air, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Galactic Defense Academy was about to become a very different place. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if they were truly prepared for what humanity had just sent them. After all, if Marcus Kane was considered average by human standards, what did that say about the rest of his species? The thought was both thrilling and absolutely terrifying. 3 days had passed since the Scout 7 incident, and Commander Vex Prime was discovering that Marcus Kane's definition of keeping property damage to a minimum was alarmingly flexible. The human had somehow managed to reprogram the Academy's automated combat drones to perform what he called interpretive dance, convinced the cafeteria's food synthesizers to produce something called pizza that had the entire student body forming cues, and most disturbingly, had begun teaching other cadets what he termed creative problem solving. The results were giving Vex Prime stress-induced molting. "Sir, we have another situation," reported Lieutenant Zara, her scales shifting to an anxious purple as she entered his office. "It involves Human Kane and the Advanced Tactical Simulation Chamber." Vex Prime's antennae drooped. "What did he do this time?" "Well, sir, he didn't exactly break anything. It's more that he solved it." "Solved what, Lieutenant?" "The Kobashi scenario, sir." Every piece of equipment in Vex Prime's office went silent. Even the air recycling system seemed to pause in respect for what had just been said. The Kobashi scenario was the Academy's ultimate test, a simulation so brutally difficult that it had a 97% failure rate among final-year cadets. It was designed to be unwinnable, a lesson in accepting noble defeat when facing impossible odds. "That's impossible," Vex Prime whispered. "The scenario has been running for 8 years. No one has ever even come close to success." Yes, sir. That's what we thought, too. Until Human Kane completed it in 43 minutes, with 0 casualties, and somehow convinced the enemy fleet to switch sides. Vex Prime felt his migraine returning with reinforcements. Explain. Lieutenant Zara consulted her tablet, though her expression suggested she didn't quite believe her own report. According to the simulation logs, Kane analyzed the tactical situation for approximately 7 minutes, then opened a communication channel with the enemy commander. He proceeded to have what the computer classified as a casual conversation about supply line vulnerabilities, morale issues among the enemy crew, and something called pension benefits. Pension benefits? Apparently, Kane convinced the enemy that their government wasn't properly taking care of veteran soldiers. He offered them better health care, educational opportunities for their offspring, and guaranteed retirement security if they switched sides. The entire enemy fleet surrendered within 36 minutes. Vex Prime stared at his subordinate for a long moment. Lieutenant Zara, are you telling me that Human Kane solved an impossible military scenario through labor negotiations? It gets worse, sir. When the simulation ended, Kane submitted a formal report recommending that the Academy establish a Department of Alternative Conflict Resolution, and suggested that most galactic conflicts could be solved with what he termed basic human resources management. The commander's 4 eyes began twitching in synchronization. Where is Human Kane now? Training Ground 7, sir. He's running combat exercises with his cadet squad. And how are those progressing? Zara's scales shifted to an even more alarmed shade of purple. Sir, you're not going to believe this, but Kane has somehow turned combat training into a team-building exercise. His squad's performance ratings have increased by 300% in 3 days. 20 minutes later, Vex Prime stood at the observation deck overlooking Training Ground 7, watching what could only be described as organized mayhem. The standard combat course, designed to test individual skills under pressure, had been transformed into something resembling a choreographed dance of destruction. Jorik, the massive Zentaurian, was no longer trying to smash through obstacles with brute force. Instead, he was carefully creating openings for his smaller teammates, while Pip used her natural luminescence to blind sensor arrays and guide the team through darkness. The Vorthan twins, Click and Clock, had stopped their nervous clicking entirely and were moving with fluid coordination that made their mandibles seem like precision instruments rather than anxiety responses. And in the center of it all, Marcus Kane moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve, with sufficient creativity and the right teammates. Time, called Instructor Grix, his reptilian features displaying what Vex Prime had learned to recognize as stunned admiration. New Academy record. Again. Kane's squad gathered around him, their various forms of celebration creating a cacophony that somehow sounded perfectly harmonious. The human was grinning that same infuriating grin he'd worn during the Scout 7 evaluation, but now Vex Prime was beginning to understand that the expression masked something far more significant than simple amusement. Cadet Kane, report to the observation deck, Vex Prime announced through the intercom. 5 minutes later, Marcus Kane stood at attention in front of the commander, though his relaxed posture suggested that military protocol was more of a suggestion than a requirement for him. Cadet Kane, in the past 3 days, you have disrupted Academy protocols, revolutionized tactical training methods, and solved a scenario that was specifically designed to be impossible. Do you have an explanation for this behavior? Kane's expression grew thoughtful. Well, sir, I suppose it depends on whether you want the official explanation or the real one. Start with the real one. The real explanation is that most of your problems aren't actually problems. They're just situations where no one has applied lateral thinking. The Kobashi scenario, for instance, assumes that military conflict is the only viable solution. But any human who's ever worked in customer service could tell you that most conflicts stem from unmet needs and poor communication. Vex Prime felt his migraine intensifying. And the official explanation? The official explanation is that I'm following standard human protocol for integration with new communities. We observe, we adapt, we improve existing systems where possible, and we build stronger teams through shared experiences and mutual support. Standard human protocol? Lieutenant Zara interjected. Kane, you're making it sound like your species has formal procedures for taking over other civilizations. Marcus blinked innocently. Take over? Who said anything about taking over? We prefer the term collaborative optimization. Before anyone could respond to this alarming statement, the facility's emergency alert system activated. Red lights flashed throughout the observation deck as a priority message appeared on the central display. Attention, Academy staff. Incoming priority transmission from Galactic Defense Command. Threat level. Maximum. Admiral Korath's imposing figure materialized in the holographic display, his 6 arms gesturing with obvious agitation. Academy Command, we have a situation. The Devourers have broken through the outer perimeter defenses of the Zerion system. 3 colonized worlds are under immediate threat, and all available fleets are minimum 48 hours away from effective engagement range. Vex Prime's blood went cold. The Devourers were the galaxy's ultimate nightmare, a species of biomechanical horrors that consumed entire worlds to fuel their expansion. They had never been successfully stopped without overwhelming military force. Furthermore, Admiral Korthak continued, long-range scans indicate that the Devourer fleet includes at least 12 consumption-class vessels and what appears to be a World Eater command ship. Current projections show complete system consumption within 72 hours. The hologram flickered off, leaving the observation deck in stunned silence. The Zerion system housed nearly 50 million civilians across 3 worlds. Even with their most optimistic response scenarios, the Galactic Defense Force couldn't possibly arrive in time to mount an effective defense. Sir, Lieutenant Zara said quietly, the Academy's training fleet includes 2 light cruisers and a destroyer. We could potentially evacuate a few thousand civilians, but against Devourers, it would be suicide, Vex Prime finished grimly, and completely ineffective. Marcus Kane, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, suddenly straightened. Commander, how long would it take to reach the Zerion system with the Academy's fastest ship? Approximately 18 hours. But Cadet Kane, I hope you're not suggesting... Actually, sir, I am. But not in the way you're thinking. Vex Prime's antennae twitched with alarm. Explain. Kane's expression had shifted from casual amusement to something far more serious. Commander, you're approaching this like a military problem that requires a military solution. But what if it's not? Kane, the Devourers are an existential threat to all biological life. They cannot be reasoned with, negotiated with, or, can't they? Kane interrupted. Sir, has anyone ever actually tried? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Dr. Yilnek spoke up from where she had been monitoring the conversation. Human Kane. The Devourers are biomechanical constructs driven by resource acquisition programming. They have no individual consciousness, no capacity for communication, no, doctor, with respect. How do you know that? Has anyone ever successfully established communication with them? Well, no. But the theoretical frameworks clearly indicate, Doctor, 3 days ago, your theoretical frameworks told you that it was impossible for a Korthak War-Beast to recognize pack leadership in a 23-year-old human with no military experience. How did that work out? Dr. Yilnek's crystalline features flickered with what might have been embarrassment. That's a fair point. Kane turned back to Commander Vex Prime. Sir, I'd like to volunteer for a reconnaissance mission to the Zerion system. Absolutely not. Kane, This is not a training exercise. The Devourers will kill you without hesitation. Maybe, or maybe they'll be curious enough about a species they've never encountered to listen for 30 seconds before they kill me, and 30 seconds might be all I need. Vex Prime stared at the human in horror. Kane, you're talking about a suicide mission based on pure speculation. No, sir. I'm talking about a communication attempt based on pattern recognition. Every species I've encountered since arriving at this academy has had the same fundamental blind spot. You assume that conflict is inevitable when communication fails. But what if communication hasn't actually been attempted? Lieutenant Zara stepped forward. Kane, even if you're right, even if the Devourers can be communicated with, you're still talking about facing down a fleet that could consume 3 worlds. Marcus's grin returned, but this time it carried an edge that made everyone in the room take notice. Lieutenant, I appreciate your concern, but you're forgetting something important. Which is, I'm human. We specialize in impossible situations. Before anyone could object further, Kane continued, Commander, I need a fast ship, a communication array, and permission to attempt first contact with the Devourer fleet. In return, I'll either solve your problem or provide enough intelligence for the Defense Force to mount an effective response when they arrive. Vex Prime found himself staring into Kane's eyes and seeing something that defied explanation. It wasn't recklessness or bravado. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before and found a way through. Kane, what aren't you telling us? The human's expression grew serious. Commander, remember when I said that every human carries the survival memories of our species? Well, one of the things we learned very early in our development is that the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones with the biggest teeth. Meaning? Sometimes they're the ones smart enough to know when to stop hunting and start talking. An hour later, Marcus Kane sat in the pilot's seat of the Academy's fastest courier ship, the Swift Arrow, as it streaked through hyperspace toward what everyone else considered certain death. But Kane had insisted on going alone, arguing that first contact protocols worked best without the complications of group dynamics. Commander Vex Prime watched the ship's departure from the Academy's command center, his 4 eyes tracking the vessel until it disappeared into the hyperspace tunnel. Next to him, Dr. Yilnek was running constant scans on the biological samples Kane had provided before departure, searching for any clue about how human biochemistry might affect Devourer response patterns. Sir, Lieutenant Zara reported, we're receiving regular updates from human Kane's ship. Current ETA to Zerion system is 16 hours, 47 minutes. And the Devourer fleet? Still advancing on the inner worlds. No change in consumption patterns or fleet positioning. Vex Prime nodded grimly. Continue monitoring, and prepare our own ships for emergency evacuation protocols, just in case Kane's plan doesn't work. Sir, if I may ask, do you think human Kane has a real chance of success? The commander considered this question for a long moment. Lieutenant, 3 days ago I would have said that it was impossible for any being to solve the Kobashi scenario, convince a Korthak War-Beast to recognize them as pack leader, or revolutionize our entire training program through casual conversation. Marcus Kane has done all 3 things without apparent effort. He paused, watching the tactical display that showed the Devourer fleet's relentless advance. So either human Kane is the luckiest being in galactic history, or there's something about human capabilities that we fundamentally don't understand. Either way, he represents our best hope for those 50 million civilians. 14 hours later, the Swift Arrow dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zerion system, and Marcus Kane got his first direct look at the Devourer fleet. The sight was enough to make most beings reconsider their life choices, but Kane simply activated his communication systems and began broadcasting on all frequencies. Attention, Devourer fleet. This is Marcus Kane, representative of the human species and the Galactic Defense Academy. I'm requesting an audience with your fleet commander for the purpose of discussing resource allocation efficiency and potential mutual benefit arrangements. The response was immediate and terrifying. Every ship in the Devourer fleet turned toward Kane's position, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with threatening energy patterns. But instead of opening fire, they simply waited. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, Kane's communication system crackled to life, with a sound that defied description. It was like hearing mathematics scream, or watching geometry have an existential crisis. But somehow, Kane understood it. Species designation, unknown. Communication attempt, unprecedented. Query: define mutual benefit parameters. Kane's grin could have powered a small space station. Now, we're talking. Back at the Academy, the command center erupted in chaos as they received Kane's initial transmission. The impossible had happened. The Devourers were actually communicating. "Sir, Doctor," Yilnek called out, her instruments registering readings that shouldn't have been possible. "The Devourer fleet has completely halted their advance. They're just waiting." Waiting for what? Apparently, they're waiting to hear what human Kane has to say. For the next 6 hours, Marcus Kane conducted the most important negotiation in galactic history from the pilot's seat of a courier ship, facing down a fleet that could have reduced him to component atoms with a single thought. But instead of weapons fire, there was conversation. Complex, multi-layered, occasionally heated conversation about resource management, sustainable consumption practices, and what Kane persistently referred to as long-term strategic planning. The breakthrough came when Kane asked a question that no one in galactic history had ever thought to pose to the Devourers. What happens when you run out of things to consume? The silence that followed lasted for 17 minutes. Then, the Devourer fleet commander's response changed everything. Query parameters: unprecedented. Consumption imperative: requires. Evaluation: resource sustainability: never computed. Long-term survival: uncertain under current protocols. Kane leaned back in his pilot's chair, his expression shifting from negotiation mode to something that looked suspiciously like a parent explaining basic life skills to a particularly bright but misguided child. See? That's the problem with pure consumption strategies. They're not sustainable. What you need is a resource management system that accounts for regeneration rates, population growth curves, and diversified acquisition methods. Explain diversified acquisition methods. Well, instead of consuming entire worlds, you establish trade relationships. You provide services in exchange for resources. You become part of the galactic economy instead of its biggest threat. It's more work initially, but the long-term benefits are enormous. What followed was a crash course in economics, diplomacy, and sustainable development practices, delivered by a human who had learned everything he knew about interspecies relations from 3 days at an alien military academy. But somehow, it worked. The Devourer fleet withdrew from the Zerion system within 12 hours, but not before establishing formal communication protocols with the Galactic Defense Command and submitting a request for economic integration consultancy services. The 50 million civilians never even knew they had been in danger. When Marcus Kane returned to the Academy 2 days later, he was met by a reception committee that included Admiral Korath, 3 sector governors, and half the Galactic Council. But the first person to greet him was Commander Vex Prime, whose expression had evolved from chronic migraine to something resembling awe. "Cadet Kane, your mission report indicates that you successfully negotiated a complete strategic realignment of the most dangerous species in known space through what you describe as basic conflict resolution techniques. How is this possible?" Kane shrugged, apparently unaware that he had just redefined the concept of diplomatic achievement. "Commander, it really wasn't that complicated. The Devourers weren't evil or malicious, They were just really, really bad at long-term planning. Once we established that consumption without sustainability leads to eventual resource exhaustion, they were quite reasonable about exploring alternatives. Admiral Korath stepped forward, his 6 arms gesturing with barely controlled excitement. Human Kane, the implications of your success are staggering. If the Devourers can be integrated into galactic society, if they can become productive members of our community, they'll probably be excellent at large-scale engineering projects, Kane agreed cheerfully. And their biomechanical technology could revolutionize everything from space construction to planetary terraforming. Really? It just took someone asking them what they wanted to accomplish, instead of assuming they were mindless destroyers. Doctor? Yilnek approached with her scanning equipment, though her readings now showed patterns that suggested resigned acceptance of impossible results. Human, Kane, I've been analyzing the communication logs from your negotiation. The linguistic complexity suggests that the Devourers have been trying to establish communication for decades, but no one ever responded to their attempts. Makes sense, Kane nodded. Most species probably interpreted their initial contact attempts as threats rather than greeting protocols. Simple miscommunication, really. Commander Vex Prime felt the last of his preconceptions about human limitations crumble into dust. Kane, I have to ask, is this normal for your species? Do all humans possess this level of diplomatic capability? Marcus considered the question seriously. Well, sir, I suppose it depends on how you define normal. Most humans learn basic conflict resolution pretty early. We have to, since we spend our entire childhoods learning to get along with family members who have completely different personalities, goals, and communication styles. You're saying that human diplomatic skills develop from family dynamics? Among other things. We also learn a lot from what we call customer service jobs, group projects, and something called office politics. By the time most humans reach adulthood, we've had extensive practice in finding common ground with beings who seem completely unreasonable at first glance. Admiral Korath's expression grew thoughtful. Human Kane, would your species be interested in establishing a formal diplomatic corps within the Galactic Defense Command? Your methods could revolutionize our approach to interspecies conflict. Kane's grin returned full force. Admiral, I think you'd find that humans are generally pretty enthusiastic about opportunities to solve interesting problems, especially when those problems involve helping people and building better communities. And what would humans want in return for such services? Honestly, probably just the chance to learn about new cultures, make new friends, and maybe get some decent pizza recipes. We're not complicated. As the formal debriefing continued, Commander Vex Prime found himself watching Marcus Kane with a mixture of admiration and growing understanding. The human hadn't accomplished the impossible through superior technology or overwhelming force. He had simply approached each challenge as a problem to be solved, rather than a conflict to be won. Later that evening, as the Academy returned to its normal routine, Vex Prime encountered Scout 7 during his regular patrol rounds. The massive Korthak War-Beast looked up from its resting position and made a soft questioning sound. Yes, Scout 7. Human Kane is back safely, Vex Prime said, surprised to find himself having a conversation with the beast. And yes, he solved the Devourer crisis exactly the way he solved everything else, by treating it as an opportunity to make new friends. Scout 7's tail began wagging, creating a rhythmic thumping against the corridor wall that somehow sounded approving. I suppose you knew all along, didn't you? Vex Prime continued. That scent signature you detected, those markers of leadership and pack management experience, you weren't reading Kane's personal history at all. You were reading the collective wisdom of an entire species that has spent thousands of years learning how to turn enemies into allies. The beast made another soft sound that needed no translation. Pack Alpha indeed, Vex Prime murmured. Though I suspect that by human standards, Marcus Kane really is perfectly average. Which means, he paused, considering the implications of that thought. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, there was an entire world full of beings like Marcus Kane. Beings who approached impossible problems with casual confidence and solved galactic crises through the simple expedient of asking the right questions. The Galactic Defense Academy was definitely going to need a bigger training program. As Vex Prime continued his patrol, he could hear the sound of laughter echoing from the cadet dormitories, where Marcus Kane was undoubtedly sharing stories with his fellow students and planning their next creative problem-solving exercise. The sound was warm, infectious, and filled with the kind of optimism that suggested tomorrow's impossible problems were simply today's undiscovered opportunities. For the first time since taking command of the Academy, Commander Vex Prime found himself genuinely looking forward to finding out what would happen next. After all, if Marcus Kane was right about humans being not complicated, then the galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place. And maybe, just maybe, a much safer one too.